Good evening, colleagues and friends of the Conservative European Forum. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for a really important and highly topical discussion, which is entitled, "Is There Hope in 2024 from the Tragedy in Israel and Gaza?" Looking particularly at what I think someone might have their microphone open. Thank you very much. If I could just begin with a bit of housekeeping, if those who are on the call could make sure that they are muted, so that we're not picking up the background noise from House of Commons, so it's always interesting to hear, that would be great. And for those who'd like to ask a question, if you could use the chat function or virtually raise their hand. I may not be able to see everybody who raised their hand because I've only got so many spaces on the call. If you use your speaker view for a better experience, those who are on the call, that would be great. But please, if you would mute, except when we get onto the questions. I'm delighted to introduce a really experienced panel to talk to us this evening, who I'm sure need little introduction to those of you who follow foreign affairs closely here. Firstly, Norbert Röttgen. Norbert is has been a member of the German Parliament since 1994. He's well known to the Conservative Group for Europe and Conservative European Forum as we are now. He chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Bundestag from 2014 to 2021. He served as German Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, was the spokesperson for legal policy and parliamentary secretary of the CDU's parliamentary group, and is a vice chair of the board of directors of the Transatlantic Association Atlantic Brücke and a member of the advisory council at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Norbert, you're extremely welcome, and your expertise is much appreciated. Charlotte Leslie will be known to many of us. Charlotte, a former MP, she's managing director of CMEC, the Conservative Middle East Council. She served as Conservative Member of Parliament for Bristol North West from 2010 to 2017, specialised in a variety of domestic issues and the Middle East, and was chair of the All Party Parliamentary Group on Saudi Arabia, and was awarded the Spectator's Backbencher of the Year award. So it's lovely to see you, Charlotte. Thank you very much, and you know this sphere extremely well. Yossi Mekelberg. Yossi has been an Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House since 2002, and has therefore seen a great deal. Previously Professor of International Relations at Regent's University, where he was Head of International Relations and Social Sciences and the Faculty Lead on Outreach Projects. He taught at Regent's University since 1996 and before there at King's College. His fields of expertise include the politics of the Middle East, Israeli politics, Middle East peace process, international relations theory, and US foreign policy towards the MENA region. So Yossi, again, knows the area and the region very well. Norbert, I'm going to come to you first. If we'd been meeting this time last year, we might have been talking about the outreach between the Saudis and the Iranians, between the UAE and the Iranians, the Abraham Accords, the plugging in of Israel into the region, and indeed the talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Even a few weeks ago, Jake Sullivan, the US envoy, spoke unwittingly about it being the quietest period in the Middle East for a couple of decades. And then on October the 7th, it all disappeared from view with an atrocious attack by Hamas and the events that have followed. And what hope there was just a little while ago seems to have changed quite markedly. So, Norbert, with your background and expertise from where we might have been, could you just give us a few minutes on where you think the hope might be in 2024 as we contemplate the what might be's in the Middle East region? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alistair. Colleagues and friends, I thank all for the invitation and for the opportunity to exchange our views, share views I'm starting with a bad conscience because I see much more tragedy in the genuine sense of the word than hope, I have to admit. And Alistair, your brief summary of where we thought half a year ago we could be in early 2024 gives proof how successful Hamas, and I would say Iran as a mastermind in the background has been. And this is my reading of what is going on. It is Hamas and Iran have successfully led Israel into a tragic trap by perpetrating this unimaginable brutality. Hamas has forced Israel to defend itself by military means and to vow to eliminate Hamas. Hamas abuses civilians as living shields against the Israeli attacks. And by this method, it is successful to have thwarted the former process of rapprochement between Israel and the Arab countries. It has, of course, tarnished and trashed the reputation of Israel, the United States, and the close allies like Germany and Britain in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, and even beyond that. So Israel and the allies are more and more isolated, and the goal to, it's part of a tragedy, to the goal to destroy Hamas might be achieved in that sense that a high degree of Hamas terrorists, the Israelis speak of around about 60% that have to be killed, might be achieved, because I can't really see anybody, any country, including the United States, being successful in putting a halt to what is happening now. But of course, at the same time, and inherently with the success of destruction of Hamas, there will be created a similar and equivalent amount of hatred as a source for new Hamas movements. And of course, it will take an unforeseeable time when there is a future chance for rapprochement and a peaceful regional order, or only a peaceful coexistence. So this has been very successful so far. I would say Hamas tries, with help and assistance of the Houthis, to achieve a conflagration in the region. It might happen more by accident, because Iran, in my view, is not interested in getting over the threshold from regional disaster and war, as we see it, to a conflagration. So I think this is not in the interest of any of the major actors, but it nevertheless may happen. It's a very dangerous situation. The perspective of it will end at some day. It will take months. 60% of terrorists, the terrorists are expected to be around about 40,000. So this means tens of thousands casualties, both terrorists and a high number, increasing number of civilians. This will not lead to any kind of political solution which is foreseeable, mainly because I can't identify a group of countries, an organization, the United Nations, or anybody who is ready to assume ownership of this problem. So there is a great deal of hopelessness in this situation. And despite the claim of politicians that any problem can be fixed and that this is the rationale of politics at all, I think we have to be realistic on the extremely limited, if at all, influence the Europeans have. I would say it's close to zero. Even the United States have very limited influence on that. So it's going on. Perhaps one remark briefly on the domestic situation of Germany, or what is Germany's stance to Israel, broadly shared in the German Bundestag. The public debate is more complex because it's so complex for ordinary voters and citizens that they can't really oversee the situation, and it's difficult for most of my compatriots to have a clear view on that. But in Parliament, it's for the first time that the line of the former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who spoke in her speech in the Knesset that the security and existence of Israel is part of the German raison d'être, the Staatsräson, as a state. And this line has now been picked up and has been used by across the political parties and across the spectrum. So there is a clear picking of sides by Germany, and broadly shared, I would say 80–90% of the German Bundestag across the spectrum, and broadly shared within our people. Of course, there were demonstrations, far less in numbers than in London and other countries. So this is a clear stance. However, of course, everybody who picks this position is part of the shift in the relationship to the Arab and Muslim world. I think we don't count anything at all after picking in this very clear way sides in this conflict. So this diminishes our further influence in the region, because the Europeans and the West being accused of applying double standards compared to our position to Russia and Ukraine have lost their credibility entirely. The political influence of us Europeans is close to zero. I leave it with that.
Norbert, thank you very much for that. And as you were honest enough to say, it's not a huge amount of hope. Could I pick up on one thing you say as a possible avenue, even in these difficult circumstances? You spoke about believing that no one is really going to be in a position to put any pressure to bring this to a halt, and spoke about the number of Hamas fighters. If you look at the maths, Israel claimed that there might be something 30,000 plus Hamas fighters, of which they believe at the moment maybe some 9,000 have been killed. That has been at the expense of over 20,000 civilians. If they are to actually achieve their objective of killing a larger proportion of Hamas fighters, then the number of civilian casualties are going to go up catastrophically high. Is there not a point at which the reservations of the US, because Tony Blinken has made that clear, President Biden's made it clear in private, that this is just not working, and this ratio of civilian casualties to Hamas fighters is insupportable? Will there be a moment when European colleagues, including the United Kingdom, can agree with this and press upon the United States that there is a point that Israel cannot go beyond because of the damage that's being done, the long-term nature of the damage, and whilst we all agree with their determination to remove the threat of Hamas, there must be a different way of doing it than the proportion of civilians who are dying. Can you see that argument being used? And if so, how soon?
Absolutely. And I think everybody is clear about that this point may be reached, and including Israel, and they want to extend the arrival at this point as far and as long as they can, and as long and as far as they can continue what they are doing, they will do that. Otherwise, so there is an inherent tragic logic in it. Otherwise, they would not even achieve this one goal, the destruction of Hamas, and they would be left by failing on that and having destroyed the perspective of any kind of political solution afterwards, not only for Gaza, but also for the West Bank. So they are determined to at least achieve this goal. And there might be a point when the consequences and the amount of collateral death and of civilians will be unbearable, even for the United States, including the domestic election campaign repercussions. This point will be met at some point, but I think it's not to be expected in the coming weeks, but it will come.
Yeah. What does that say? You can see that. That's the man.
Do you think
the cut out of the screen?
Can we? Someone has got their microphone open, please. Jerry and Robert. Thank you very much. Norbert, last question before I move on to Charlotte. Do you think that goal of eliminating Hamas is in any way credible?
No, it's inherently a dilemma, and this is part of the tragedy. By achieving the goal, Israel is creating the fertile ground for new terrorism and the next Hamas grouping. It may take, so they might be able to destroy the current structure and organization of Hamas, but by achieving it, they are creating the new Hamas. So in a way, it is and it is not in the longer run.
No, but thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be questions when we come to that section, but thank you very much indeed for your appraisal and the background to it. Thank you. Charlotte, you know the Arab world well, spend time in it. We're at the Doha Forum quite recently, so you have spoken to significant figures in the Arab world. How do they see this in terms of where we might have been and the disruption which there now is, and their hopes for a different Middle East? What's your feel about this now?
Thanks, Alistair. I'm going to try and answer your exam question of, is there any hope? I guess if you're trying to pull silver threads of any silver lining of hope out of it, it's firstly that I suppose these atrocities have forced the recognition issue that people have liked to have thought had gone away, both across the Middle East region and in the West and domestically. Palestine had fallen way down on the list of things to be discussed. Of course, it hadn't. And you could argue, I guess, that it's better to recognise an issue that is actually there than to ignore it, although perhaps we're seeing now the consequences of ignoring it. And secondly, perhaps if there's any hope, it is, and particularly maybe from the Arab states in particular, it's that the West becomes a little more self-aware and begins to understand the importance, if it is to talk about upholding rule of law and things like this, that this is done without fear or favour and without making exceptions for any particular state. I thought Norbert talking about tragedy was particularly apt. If you look at what we're seeing, it's a situation born of trauma. It's a situation born of trauma through the foundation of the modern state of Israel, which was founded through deeply traumatic circumstances. It's trauma from the 75 years of Israeli independence with the Nakba of the Palestinian people who were removed from their homes. And it's born of trauma of the West, who allowed the most atrocious Holocaust of the Jewish people to happen. And I guess what we're seeing is that trauma and reaction to trauma leads nowhere good. I'd say that what I saw at Doha for two things. Firstly, an amazement at what the West had let itself do. The West has for a long time been diminished in its role as a global ally of choice amongst our former allies in the Gulf, with whom our security relationship is incredibly important. Many will say, particularly around, around the Gulf, that happened from the Obama era, and from their point of view, our complete misreading of the Arab Spring and the actual democratic nature versus Islamist takeover or political Islam takeover, which made them feel less that we were less reliable partners. And then, of course, you see the move towards the BRICS countries. People have been talking for a long time about the need for the West to compete to be a global ally of choice for the Middle East. And maybe there was some ground to claw back pre-October the 7th. What I see is absolute amazement from the Arab world that the West should have responded quite so unconditionally for not Israel, but Netanyahu, who is a controversial character within Israel. That was seen to be a very strange judgment if the West values its own self-interest. Because what has happened since then, as I've had people say to me, you guys, i.e. the West, never talk about human rights, humanitarian considerations, or rule of law ever again. Have lost all authority on that. And it's very hard to see how we make that back because of the initial chances we took. Yep, we're pivoting views, we're becoming a little nuanced, a bit more sophisticated. Maybe there will be a time at which our unconditional support to Netanyahu, and I say Netanyahu, not Israel, because I think they're two different things, is revised. But it may already be too late. Because the second thing I saw at the Doha Forum was a great sense of, and I hate bringing up such bad news, but it's important we understand it, a changing of the guard. We are very isolated in our conversations here in the West. Ukraine, Russia is not seen in the same way as it's seen here in the rest of the world. The global South is a very different place. You're seeing people moving towards BRICS, and there was a sense of momentum that things were changing and the time of the global South and the BRICS nations was coming. And what was really chilling and really fascinating in a very bad way was to hear the language that the West has been using about competition, human rights, rule of law, used without irony by China, Iran, and Russia in their intervention, with two fingers to the West, saying, you guys used to do this, but look, if you want someone to step in and really broker an agreement with Israel, Gaza, you can't rely on the West because they're self-proclaimed one side. You're going to have to go to China. If you're going to look for someone to broker between Saudi and Iran, go to China. And I cannot emphasize enough how much energy and optimism there was because the West was seen to have thrown away its major credentials. What do we do about that? I think a certain amount of self-awareness and strength of humility may go some way to reassuring those states which want to be our allies, like our way of life. They want to come to London. They want us to do better. And I think there is a bit of room for maneuver. But I think first, in order to maximize that, we have to recognize the extent of the problem. And I don't see, and observers don't see evidence within our policy circles that we have understood exactly what we were doing when we chose the stance that we took following October the 7th. The other thing I think that they are amazed that we are not calculating is just as Norbert said, you can kill one, eliminate one Hamas asset, but you've created 1,000 more. And again, I think it's not so much, well, this choice we made, but I think it's the lack of demonstration that we were eyes wide open as to the choices we were making when we chose the stance we chose. And I think that is why those who are the West's rivals and enemies see such an opportunity. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but it's better to see a bad reality and deal with it than to stick your head in the sand.
Thank you, Charlotte. Can I remind those who are on the call, please put something in Q&A if you want to be called so that you can ask a question. We have Norbert with us until 7 o'clock. So I'm particularly keen if anybody wants to ask a question of Norbert, if you would indicate that in the chat, I'd be very grateful. Charlotte, one question to you. While you're in Doha talking there, their comments about the West are very clear and the way they see the narrative is very clear. Does anyone ever criticize Hamas for the violence they showed on October the 7th, the taking of hostages, or is it all completely one-sided that it's not their fault?
No, I mean, there was a huge amount of criticism of Hamas. And I think the perception there, and this is just observations, is that explanation isn't justification. So people will say, well, what do you expect? You create Gaza, you build up this pressure cooker, just as the Jordanians were saying. I was in Jordan weeks before October the 7th, and the Jordanians were saying, look, this has not gone away. There's provocations from violent settlers, Netanyahu's provoking, the West isn't doing anything. This is about to blow. You guys really need to take this seriously and do something, otherwise something terrible is going to happen. So they were saying, look, this is what happens when you create a situation. You can't be amazed that it does. I think there's a frustration that as soon as someone says that, Western media says, oh, you're justifying it. Now, there are a small minority, but there are a significant minority of people who justify it. And the more there's a sense of perception of injustice and double standards from the West, the angrier people get, and that moves people much more over to a sympathetic position of Hamas. However, there was just an assumption that, of course, people condemn it. Of course, people condemn the terror attack of Hamas and would call it that. There was another frustration that whenever it's talked about, all Western commentators want to do is say, do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas if you're brown and Muslim? And there are some memes going around on social media and WhatsApp groups of, a Muslim couple getting married saying, do you, lady, take this man to be your husband? And you, sir, do you condemn Hamas? And that's the way the region is feeling. Yeah, they condemn Hamas, but what about what's going on with Gazan civilians? And I think it's an easy narrative to say, everyone who is, I'm going to say it very bluntly, the perception is that everyone who's brown and Muslim is kind of on the side of Hamas. That's the kind of racist stereotyping they feel that the West is making of them. Whether that's justified or not, that's perception, and it matters. And there's a deep frustration that you can't move on from that, because that is almost taken as a given. And equally, there are those who are very angry that Hamas has actually acted against the interests of the Palestinian people. It was obvious that Israel was going to react in a very in a very extreme, very robust way. It was obvious that civilians were going to suffer. Many of the Hamas leadership are sitting in Qatar, Tehran, Turkey, and so there is also anger that Palestinian civilians have suffered for what Hamas has tried to do as well. So yeah, there absolutely is.
Thanks, Yossi. We've heard a very good description from both Norbert and from Charlotte of the sharply polarized position there is on this issue. In my experience of 40 years of looking at this issue, I've never known the bitterness between the two counterpoints of view to be as great, and for there be a lacking of any middle ground. Norbert speaks about his sense that the Israelis are determined to press on in Gaza almost no matter what, and Charlotte presents an extremely good picture of how this is seen, and gives us a sense that whatever narrative we might come out with, those who have supported the state of Israel to this stage, it isn't how it's seen by other people, and the world looks very different. From your observations, again over a lengthy period of time, this degree of sharp bipartisanship and an unwillingness to recognise anything in the argument of the other, is there a chance that the situation is just so bad that the hope is that because it's so bad, there can only be something better after all this? What's your sense, Yossi, from your experience?
Thanks, Alistair, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. And I listened to the very, very interesting intervention, to earlier interventions here. And I think the word hope is crucial. Of course, there is bitterness on both sides, but what could we expect after the events we've seen between 7th of October and today? Bitterness has been accumulated for decades. It's not even 75 years. You can go even before that. But let's put it as kind of arbitrarily at 1948, when you have the Nakba, and you have the wars, and you have the terrorism, and you have the occupation, there is blockade. So it would be a miracle if people won't actually harbor all this pain and trauma and bitterness to one another. And there is exactly where, and I say we failed, and it's a very kind of failed as an international community, failed as Israelis and Palestinians, failed as a region, failed probably as human beings in bringing this to an end. Now, since Charles started with hope, because this was our task, to talk about hope. Of course, this is something part of human nature. If you have no hope, well, what's the point of living? What's the point of having this conversation if you don't have hope? But hope for the sake of hope is hollow. We need hope based on changing the situation on the ground. And right now, we don't give people much reason for hope. And definitely not the last three and a half months. We need to face the reality right now. When people say, oh, we're never going back to the 6th of October, in a way that is correct, yes, the situation has changed dramatically. But some of the underlying issue hasn't changed. The need to ensure that everyone has, Israelis and Palestinians have the same rights, political, human, and social, and civil rights. This hasn't changed. The fact that everyone deserves to live in security, this hasn't changed. The right of everyone to live free of fear, this hasn't changed. The right to prosperity, this hasn't changed. So these things are still there. The problem, they're more urgent than ever. But the severity of the situation is worse than ever. Definitely since 1948. So we need to deal with a different situation as a result of it. I think first we have to recognize where we failed, and we failed with all this illusion of status quo. For way too long, the international community, there is certain elements among the Palestinians, fell into this trap of status quo. Status quo is an illusion that is created or injected into the conversation by those who are in a privileged position because they're comfortable with it. And Israel continued to expect settlement. And Israel continued to confiscate land. And on the way to annexation. And we saw with the right-wing government in Israel that was formed a year ago. As a result of it, but to expect, again, it's no one, just to put it on the table, nothing justified 7 October. Nothing can justify what Hamas did. It probably caused more harm, not possibly, most definitely caused more harm Palestinians than anything could have caused. And Shout, I've been to Doha, I completely agree with what you say about there was condemnation, including by the Prime Minister of Qatar, of 7th of October from the podium. So there was no sense of anyone, I think, that even accept, that it was acceptable, let alone condone it. It was condemned. But I know that Secretary General Guterres got into a lot of trouble when he said that nothing happens in vacuum. But this is the reality, nothing happens in vacuum. Not to justify it, but then we need to understand. And that's the other thing. There is the problem of looking at issue as status quo. The second thing, that we became addicted to conflict management instead of prevention, resolution, and peace building. And as a result of it, we let certain conditions to fester. But the fact, and we have discussions before so many times, to expect people to live under occupation or being blockaded, that they won't try to liberate themselves or won't look for liberation, was a fantasy that some people wanted to believe that it was possible. Now, if you add to this that the international community lost interest, Europe lost interest for two reasons, or maybe even for more than two reasons. A, and this is a kind of the self-indulgent that I don't think we are capable to afford in international relations. It's too difficult to resolve. If this is the approach we'll take to a lot of things in world affairs, we won't deal with almost anything. Ukraine is too difficult to resolve. The Sahel is too difficult to a lot of things, but we can't afford not to try and resolve them. Crisis between the United States and China is big. But when we let, and that's what happened in Ukraine as well, we let it fester as a result of it, we find ourselves in a much worse situation. We know, it's 30 years from Oslo, since Oslo, the heyday of Oslo. At a certain point, we gave up on Oslo. We gave up on the ability to sign a peace agreement. And I think this led to this kind of despair. On the other hand, the conversation changed. I'm not against normalization between Israel and the Arab world. I'm not against the Abraham Accord, or even if Saudi Arabia decided to normalize. But the only way that it could have been interpreted is by sidelining the Palestinian issue, not as another tool to reassure Israel that it has friends in the region and hence it can take more risks for peace with Palestinians, but it's actually an opportunity to sideline completely the Palestinian issue. Again, Palestinians could have taken a completely different route in dealing with that, and there are different routes. Now we can't also ignore that the question from during the Trump administration generally, if only economic conditions would improve in Palestine, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank, Palestinians will abandon their political aspirations. This was not viable to begin with, and it's never a possibility. And we need to move hand in hand with the political, the social, the rights-based conversation, but also to accept that in this process, and I talk again I put my European hat here, though I know the UK is not part of the EU anymore, so some hat within this area, is that we have interests that are not necessarily overlap with US interests. We are following US interests when it comes to in the Middle East. We are different in our interests than the United States, and we need to develop policies that actually reflect our interest in the region, generally with the Israeli Palestinians, and we also reflect our values. We reflect some of the values with the United States, but not all of them with the United States. So we need also to develop, and also we are all actually more susceptible or more, I think, vulnerable to changes in the Middle East. Hence, we have to develop this more proactive attitude. And let me just say one more thing about practical thing. I'll just give in one practical. And an organization, and you're an agency, because I was involved in many ways for many years, is UNRWA. We let so many bodies to attack UNRWA and portray it as almost the source of all evil in between the Israelis Palestinians, not as the one that provides shelter, not the one that provides education, not the one that provides health, not the one that actually so many were killed or have been killed so far in the war. And we in the UK actually cut the budget by more than 10% only last year when this organization is spared. So instead of when we talked about that economic situation might make peace more conducive, we do exactly the opposite and harm this. And I think there is, again, going back and finish with this of hope. We need to work on creating hope for people to believe. Right now, and I think, Charlotte, you mentioned trauma. We are facing two nations with huge trauma. I'm hearing things from both sides that worry me immensely. Maybe we need more than politicians or political scientists, we need psychologists right now. But we need to address it, because to build a minimum trust in order for them to move forward, will take an immense effort. And I'll stop here.
I'm very grateful, Yossi. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, and we have a number of questions, and I wanted to ask if Ed Baldry would raise his question and direct it to you, Yossi, if I may, in the first place, and then I'm going to go to John Bois after Ed. So, Simon, if you'd like to bring Ed in, and if you'd ask your question, Ed, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, it's actually Tony Baldry. I think
Ed sorry.
No, Alistair. I think Ed, my son, set up my iPhone, and I think he interfered. Anyway, so my question is this really: Israel is an occupying power of Palestine. So, what duty of care under international law does the state of Israel owe to people in Gaza and the West Bank? And I suspect this also ties up. I mean, I can't be the only one. It's becoming increasingly pessimistic about ever there being a two-state solution. So there's not a two-state solution. At some point, the citizens of Gaza and the West Bank have to become citizens of Israel. They can't be an occupied people for eternity. And they have to have the same democratic rights as other people in Israel. And there seem to be some very basic questions of international law here that need to be addressed.
Okay, that's why I'm Tony, it's great to have you on. And that's why I thought I'd go to Yossi just on the international law questions, first of all, just to give a feel on that, please. Responsibility of duty of care as an occupying power here.
Occupying power by international law, by the Geneva Convention, has duty of care for the well-being of those occupied. Now, Gaza became, since 2005, a sort of unique place. So Israel claimed to withdraw, and physically it withdrew, but it was in complete control of Gaza. Now it's in control of Gaza because we have the military there, but it was in control of Gaza through blockade. It was in control of, with the exception of the border with Egypt, on the rest of the borders, sea and land. And now I think the idea of this is, think about in terms of jail. The prisoner guards are not inside the jail, but they are still in control of the jail. So they have, again, the duty of care for what's happening in the jail. Again, it's not to exonerate Hamas the way it runs the place, and I really I believe that the people of Gaza deserve way better than Hamas. We can go also back to the way that the response by the West to the election of 2005, which was problematic as well. But as far as concerned, the occupying force has responsibility for the well-being, for the security of the occupied. Israel will say, we left it. And again, there is the myth that developed in Israel. We leave territories and we are answered with rockets. This in relations to Lebanon in 2000, and it's in relations to Gaza. Two very different cases. In the case of Gaza, the withdrawal was unilateral, so it was not part of an agreement, and the blockade was imposed after Hamas was elected, so which leads to this responsibility and duty of care.
Okay, thank you, Yossi. I'm going to ask John Bois first, and then Nicholas McLean. I'm going to bring Norbert in to answer your question, John. So I hope it's one appropriate for him to, because I'm keen to hear further from Norbert either reflections on what you've heard from Yossi and Charlotte up to now, and also in answer to the question. John, good to have you on.
Thank you.
What's your question?
Thanks, Alistair. And it's a question which I'm hoping applies to everyone, but I want first to draw out from something Charlotte has said, and to stress the fact which the public in this country certainly doesn't understand, which is that Hamas is not the same as Gaza. Gaza is dominated at the moment by leadership of Hamas, but if you've been to Gaza, as I have twice, you see there a community which is like any other community, business and trade and shops and churches, and I stress churches because it was a surprise, I think, to a lot of people that one of the damage attacks was against a Christian church in Gaza. But I've also seen, when I've been there, shown by UN doctors, the damage that's been done to people, not least children with phosphorus bullet burns and so forth. But I've also met in Palestine, in Israel, the groups of women from both communities who have been striving to get a better understanding between the two. And we haven't heard from them recently. And I think the question that I see has been put about Netanyahu. I think he is the major problem in many ways. It's a shame we don't still have Sharon and his ideas of what might be the future. But that's a matter for the people of Israel to decide. What I want to hear from our panel, if we may, is we've got to look for hope, even if there's no hope at the moment. We have to look for it. And I think those women show perhaps one way. And I'd be grateful to hear from each of you whether you can think of other ways of encouraging that sort of hope for the future.
I'm going to ask Norbert and Charlotte to answer this simply because it's confined a bit to time. Otherwise, we will run out. And Yossi can always come in afterwards in relation to another question. Norbert, finding hope in recognizing that Gaza, whatever the Israeli government might say, does have innocent civilians in it, and they're not all Hamas. What do you make of it?
This is absolutely clear. I have to say it was even more clearer before October 7th that Hamas, of course, was in control, in a way, the ruling force for 15 years in Gaza. But my first intervention here in the Bundestag was that we have to stick to make a difference between Hamas and the Palestinians. So we have to be absolutely clear about that. However, the polling shows that, I would say surprisingly, strikingly, the support for Hamas has increased in recent months and weeks, both within Gaza and the West Bank. So this seems to be a poll effect which has been found. To Netanyahu, I'm not the expert, but I have no doubt that Netanyahu's days in power are counted. Of course, he has his motivation. I would also say he is, of course, trying to even instrumentalize this situation for his political survival. I think there is no way that this can be successful. However, I spoke this morning to three hostages or the family members of people who were taken hostage, a baby, mother killed. So this has collectively traumatized. I think that we have to see on both sides, and I think this has to be seen. What I could, if I think about hope, I would say what can give a hint at hope is the time factor. We have to be clear that time is measured differently in this conflict, and what we perhaps should think about, how could we help to build a bridge that helps, that gives some time for working on traumas, for enabling people to come together while keeping a distance. I think it's absolutely unrealistic to expect a few months or 1 or 2 years after the end of this war that there is a human ability to meet each other and work on solutions. So how could this bridge be constructed? Who could build the bridge which gives time that enables a political process?
Thanks. I'm just going to pause there. Charlotte, can I keep you until after 7? Because we've only got Norbert for another 6 minutes. And I thought make full use of your time, if I may, Norbert. Could I ask Nicholas, and then immediately after Amber Rudd, to give you 2 questions, and then Norbert can answer those before you go. So Nicholas McLean first, followed immediately, Simon, if I may, by Amber, and questions as tight as possible to make full use of Norbert's time to be able to answer. Nicholas McLean first.
Thank you, Alistair. I was involved in close discussions, negotiations with Israelis, including Likud, and Palestinians 10, 15 years ago. And we came very close to sensible solutions, which were then undone by the extremists. I felt, Norbert, you were in a way a bit too negative, talking about when the time is right, maybe in a few weeks, who knows, months. I think that it's long overdue for the West to be taking a much tougher attitude to Israel. They've gone far beyond normal self-defense, and they're clearly breaking many of the rules of humanitarian and international law. So I wondered if you and others could talk about what more could be done to expedite aid getting into Gaza, not just talking about it. A month ago, Grant Shapps said he was seeing what the Navy could do. The Jordanians have been making airdrops, apparently. I think that the West's reputation would improve if it was seen to be more effective, not just providing words, and when critical of Israel, very soft words.
Okay, thanks, Nicholas, very much. And Amber, your question?
Thank you. Just to say, Norbert, I agree with you that Israel is doing great damage to itself as well as to its target at the moment, particularly in creating additional terrorists all the time, as long as it continues with this. But to your point about bridges, who will lead on forming that bridge? It feels that everybody feels quite isolated, and even a lot of the countries in the Middle Eastern region, they want to help with aid, they do not want to get involved. And yeah. Israel looks isolated from every angle, except perhaps from the Americans. But even then, the Americans have taken their position. It may give them permission to be heard in a way by the Israelis when they call for a ceasefire. But who will lead on this bridge? Who can start the end of this terrible continued war?
Mm. Thanks, both. Yes, Norbert.
Perhaps, I share the negative fundamental feeling underlying your question. I think there is one element we, despite all negativity, we should not oversee. Israel desperately needs a political process, a solution to the Palestinian question in order to be able to again live safe and secure in its own country and its homeland. So if we assume that this conflict does not find any progress in compromise or solution, it will be a permanent threat to the security and perhaps even very existence of Israel. We haven't talked about Iran and the possibility of Iran becoming a nuclear power in not that far away time. So I think this is something where we could work on, that Israel creates a kind of rational openness to see that it really desperately needs an idea of the post-war period. Can we be tougher on Israel? Perhaps I would not answer the question, but just to give an impression on the German debate. Germany is very, very close to Israel, and even a wording and a intervention by hinting at that this conflict has a context, as the Secretary General has done, creates problems in Germany. So there is the German media and the the professional political scenery is very close to Israel. And I have to be honest that the Palestinians are really, it's embarrassing to say, but it's the sense of this discussion to give a realistic picture, that the Palestinians are really a fringe group and nearly not discussed in the German public debate, which is in any case fading to the fringe areas of public debate and awareness. So there is getting used to what is going on effect. When there were 7,000 or 8,000 people killed in Gaza, this was the news, and now we have reached the level of 25,000 death toll, and it's not a debate and not even hardly a news in the German media. So who could start the bridge building process? So it has to. So the Israelis have to want and have to come to the conclusion that they have an interest in this bridge. Then I would say there are opportunities to start with this work, and I'm not totally pessimistic that there is a day that Israel comes to the conclusion and to the clear insight it's in our very fundamental existential interest to start something of which we can't foresee how it will proceed and where it will end.
Norbert, I want to let you go now. It's past 7 o'clock. I just wanted to say, a really warm thank you on behalf of all of us. Germany's relationship with Israel is understood by all of us in the context you said it. It doesn't make for easy listening or easy debate within Germany, I'm sure. And you confront the issues, and you have done very straightforwardly with us tonight. So thank you very much for that. I would like to say we won't need to talk about this again, but we all know that we will, sadly, unless we can find the hope that the situation has become so difficult it can never be marginalized again and can only be dealt with properly, because that's the only way in which Israelis are going to be secure, Palestinians are going to be secure and have justice, and the region can get on with a different future. And Germany will play a major part in that. I don't think any of us have any doubt, and you with your expertise and everything. So thank you very much for being with us. Please slip out if you want, but I'll turn the questions elsewhere. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
To go back to give Charlotte and Yossi a chance, the three questions that we've talked about with Norbert recently, John Boas asking, the hope in Gaza is that it is a more mixed population than people would believe. Amber asked, who's going to build the bridges in order to get to where we need to get to with a solution? And Nicholas raised the issue about had we been a little over generous to Israel in the past, and has that led partly down the track where we are now? Charlotte, do you want to take what you wish out of those questions first? And unmute, Charlotte.
Yeah. I guess it's back to, how do we find hope? Where do we find hope? There are certainly populations are not homogenous. There are those within all the populations who want to build bridges, and it's up to all of us to find those and empower them. But the challenge you always have is that moderation and building bridges is never as easy to market as fear-mongering extremes, which are far more easy to market and far more easy to mob whip. So there's a fundamental challenge with how you make, for want of a better way of putting it, how do you make moderation sexy? There's the other thing of, that old adage, change happens, the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. And I think we may be reaching a point where the pain is the pain of changing. And I guess three entities being asleep at the wheel or ignoring things, or rather thinking they don't exist and buying into, I love Yossi's description of status quo as an illusion by the people for whom it suits. I mean, it's not only the West, I think, that could have an awful lot more to hold Israel to the same standards as it holds other states. I'm thinking particularly of a response to illegal settlements and other things before October the 7th. The Gulf states and the Middle East, it suited many people there to kind of think that the Palestinian issue had gone away, that you could just move on with the Abraham Accords and somehow paper over this gaping chasm that people wanted to feel was no longer. This has been a very stark reminder that, of course, it is very much there. And a senior Gulf state figure said how surprised many people were that the younger generation, from 5 years old to 18 years old, were so viscerally pro-Palestinian. And they thought that perhaps the younger generation would have moved on from that and not listened to it. If the Gulf states in particular in the Middle East is recognizing that this has not gone away, and it will drive, not necessarily the only cause, but it will drive the major conflicts in the region, maybe it's time to stand up and take actions and be proactive in a way that only Middle East regional states can do in pushing for a solution. And I think Saudi is a particularly interesting case in point. The conversations that were starting to be had with Israel means that there is an element of trust that has built up there which didn't exist, say, a decade or so ago. At the same time, it's been very robust in defending the Palestinian cause and is able to have trust there and sway over Hamas. There's no friend of Saudi. You know, for these groups, no friend of Gulf states, for the most part, Qatar accepted. So I think there may be Gulf players, and Qatar included, which occupies a very different position, which may realise that for their own self-interest, national self-interest and security, and to manage an Iran, while there's been a rapprochement, no one, you know, the tensions may be dormant, but they haven't disappeared. Those historical sectarian differences with Iran and the Sunni Gulf states do still exist. It may be that the Gulf states step forward both with money and diplomacy, particularly if they see the West falling back. They may want to come and take a more centre stage and not just leave it all to China. And then within Israel, the Israeli people may look at the promises and the mechanisms of security through force and realise that this hasn't worked out well, and that the Netanyahu kind of approach is not something that's going to build a future where Israel is a secure place for the Jewish people. And it may be, I very much hope it is, that things move away from where they've been. Of course, there's always the risk that when things get bad, the elastic breaks and they get even worse because everyone's even more traumatized, everyone makes worse decisions because everyone's reactive. But it's also the case, particularly perhaps amongst the younger generation, that those protests we've seen and the distraction from Israel's security that Netanyahu has indulged in with his own domestic dramas are something people want to move away from. So maybe the pain of staying the same will be greater than the pain of change, and change will happen in the right direction.
We have a question, more than one question on Mr. Netanyahu coming up. But Yossi, do you have any comments on the questions we've had up to now?
Yeah, about building bridges. I think, you know, the years after Oslo was all about building bridges. Everyone went to have a program of people to people and invest in building understanding, and then it's all disappeared. And it got to a point that actually Palestinians see talking to Israelis, young Palestinians see it as normalization. And when I met Palestinians wearing my British hat, so you can talk to me, and they will talk to me, and they said, no, talking to other people is not normalization because the situation is not normal. But you can go and give each other hell if you like, but don't stop talking to us, build the bridges. And there are a lot of candidates, not only on diplomatic level, not only building this, because I think part of the problem of the Oslo Agreement was it was a peace between elites. The idea that there is no need for a critical mass. There is no need to build trust between the people themselves, because there was a notion that the minute that the elite decided it must be peace, it's going to happen. It's actually Netanyahu, in his own cynical way, realized that he could derail it. And also other organizations. whether Palestinians or within the Israeli, the settler, for instance, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all realize that if they want to derail, they can actually build on destroying the bridges. And now, for years now, Israel's Palestinians, definitely since the Second Intifada, don't see each other. They don't know about their existence beyond walls. And this is not conducive for any peace. Now, since I know there are a lot of politicians on this call, I don't have to tell you, the minute that the Israeli-Palestinian peace process seem to be not as a winner, but as something that you're basically bang your head against it, you didn't see many that were ready actually to work in it. And whenever, I know as a think tank, we talk about, that the situation before 7 October, the situation is unsustainable. The situation is going to implode. Then came the status quo thing, out of fear that if you agree with us, it means we need to do something about it. We need to do something, and these are the bridges. Now, I don't think, the US is still important in doing that. Whatever we think about US policies, we still need it involved, but we need a more involved European Union. I don't think, just last point there, that China is really involved to become an interlocutor. From what I hear from different discussions, there is no appetite there to play a major role as a peace broker.
Thank you. We've got two specific questions on Prime Minister Netanyahu's position. If I could ask both Asia and then immediately afterwards Harriet to ask their questions, and I'd be very grateful if you could just read out the questions. They're sufficiently long to convey your feelings about it, but we'll only get the answers in if friends could be very tight when they ask their questions. So Asia, could we have your question first, and then immediately after Simon, could you bring in Harriet? So we'll deal with Mr. Netanyahu in a block just now. Asia.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alistair. I think some of the part of my question is already been answered. But basically, this is a question for both of you, Charlotte and Yossi. So when do you think is the West going to recognize that supporting Israel doesn't mean blindly supporting Netanyahu? There's the big difference between the two. Not only Netanyahu, but also some of his government ministers calling for genocide. They're outright in the Knesset calling for genocide. So isn't the continuing state of affairs just postponing the inevitable at the end? And I think, Yossi, you mentioned, which is the removal of Netanyahu eventually, and facing his fraud charges that he's just postponing and facing jail. I mean, during a recent conversation with the Jordanian ambassador, he pointed that out. He said, in the end, he's a cheat and a liar, he would end up in jail. So how many more innocents need to die? And how long do we need to wait to call for a ceasefire now?
Thank you, Asia.
Thank you.
Harriet?
Thank you,
if you're still there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Apologies, some dodgy headphones are not helping my microphone. Thank you so much, Yossi and Charlotte, for making the time. I'll be very prompt with my question. So I think the thing that I was particularly interested in is whether or not, in your opinion, Netanyahu's position appears untenable. I think you've sort of both touched on that a little bit. I think it's very clear that his reputation in the West has even further deteriorated, and I think you hear very similar reports of within Israel itself. So I'm curious as to whether or not you feel there's a viable pathway for a more moderate leader. And also I'm curious about what your views are of sanctions against West Bank settlers, as I feel that the West is showing its impatience there as well.
Thank you, Harriet. It was noticeable when the demonstrations were taking place against Prime Minister Netanyahu's government on the internal issues. There seemed to be a very clear separation between that and the Palestinian issue. Has that now changed because of the events that have happened? So Charlotte first, then Yossi.
So can I just interrupt, Alistair? Are you referring to the Supreme Court issue?
Yes, I was. I was just lodging that with Yossi and with Charlotte, because the Israeli population had seemed to separate their concerns about Netanyahu's government and its attack on what they consider the attack on the judiciary from the Palestinian issue. which had not been a large part of Israeli politics for some time. And I was just wondering if both Yossi and Charlotte thought that had changed, and also to answer the questions about whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu's position is now tenable, and what the West should be doing about it, rather than blindly supporting him and some of his extremely questionable ministers. Charlotte first.
Yeah, I mean, I think his position is untenable, but Netanyahu is quite extraordinary at holding on, and the alternatives for him of not holding on are pretty. So it's a question of how long grip and what will he do, which is worrying, in order to hold on to himself from the abyss. I can't predict, but I don't think it's going to be very pretty. On the population, it's certainly the case that it didn't mean that protests against Netanyahu were all for a different settlement with Palestine prior to October the 7th. However, and I think Yossi will be able to answer this more fully, what I do detect is a growing understanding of how Netanyahu's approach has let them down in terms of security, and has pointed out failings of the philosophy that you can just keep your foot on the neck of the enemy and everything will be fine. So I wonder if what has happened, the failings and the demonstration that you cannot securitize your way out of a situation, things will secure without a political settlement, in some resonance. I haven't been in Israel since October the 7th, so I don't feel in a very good position to comment on what's going on, but I think that certainly is a tendency. Finally, why is it that particularly, and I'll talk about my party, why do we confuse with Liz Truss's Jewish population very well amongst the small interest groups that she spoke to, but did not go down at all the wider Jewish people in the UK, demonstrating just how unrepresentative some of the voices that are loudest in Parliament are of Jewish people and Israeli supporters in the UK.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yossi?
Thank you. I thought that Netanyahu's position in power was untenable from the moment he was indicted on 3 cases of corruption for fraud, bribery, and breach of trust. The idea that he didn't suspend himself, or the Knesset suspended himself, it made the situation tricky, and I think led to the weakness of Israel, and also dealing with the events of October 7. Now, the minute, not only, I think, in almost a way, Netanyahu said, maybe I'm not perfect, maybe I like my champagnes and cigars, maybe I do this or the other, but at least I'm Mr. Security. At least I'm the defender of Israel's security. This collapsed altogether in a matter of few hours. And part of it has to do the way that during the 10 months before October 7, because of the way that he treated the military. Then let's not forget, he already fired the defense minister for warning him that's the way he is going about the assault on the judiciary, going to compromise Israel's security, only because of pressure within, among the people, the protest. He actually was forced to bring back Yoav Gallant. So I think to a large extent, you don't really need a big investigation to know that, and the responsibility to something so catastrophic lies with the prime minister, and any prime minister with minimum of decency would have resigned. Now, to say that you don't change a prime minister during war, I think in the UK we have quite a successful experience with that. Quite a while ago, and it worked to win a war, quite an important one. So this is possible. It's right when the prime minister is not the problem itself, when the prime minister is the problem itself, then there is a need to replace the prime minister. And you look at all public opinion polls in Israel, and Likud won't get more than 18 seats, while Benny Gantz is on 37 and Lapid on around 20, so they can form a coalition rather easily, which is not something which is common in Israeli politics. I think the point that you make about the demonstration, because this was my greatest biggest argument with my friends in Israel that protested, and I was actually during the protest, some of the protests in Israel, don't mention the occupation. Don't talk about the occupation. It's interfere with, we save the democracy and you want to talk about occupation. And my argument was from day one. This is at the heart of the problem, the occupation. You can't have in a democracy two system, legal system, that one that allows certain thing and another that not. Just as an example, you see, I'm against demolition of houses, families of terrorists to begin with. But the fact is, the very Supreme Court that we try to protect and defend in this protest would allow the demolition of terrorist houses. Well, they've been there, their families' houses, but if it's a Jewish terrorist that will commit something like this, it won't allow. So I mean, it's actually a demonstration that there are two legal systems for Palestinians and for Israelis, and there is no democracy when you have something like this, but they refuse. Is there a change? Right now, I don't see any change. I think we need to wait for after the war, and I hope that new forces, new realignments within the Israeli politics will start to reassess. But first we need ceasefire. First we need some political arrangement that will calm the situation down, and then more reflection.
Thanks. We've only got 10 minutes and we've got 3 really good questions. So I'm asking people again to be very tight, if I may. But I'd like to look ahead at this stage, and I want to take Peter Dawson's question if you're there. So I'm going to ask Peter if you would be ready to just rattle off your question, if you would, and then I'm going to come to, I think it's Neil Stevenson, and then there's a final question about the Houthi attacks. But perhaps, Peter, could ask your question first, if you're still there. I don't know, Simon, if Peter is still there. If not, then I'm going to ask.
He's still logged on. But,
all right, Peter, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in because of time. You got him now?
No, I'll bring in Neil.
Okay, bring in Neil, and then I'll ask Peter's question afterwards. Neil, please.
No, I think maybe go to the next one, Alistair.
All right, I'm just going to ask the questions. Peter Dawson's question was this: how will the response of the West adapt with Starmer as UK Prime Minister and Trump as US President? What's your feel looking ahead? I would say this is probably not the official position of the Conservative European Forum. But go on. What difference will Keir Starmer and I was going to say Boris Trump and President Trump make? Yossi first, then Charlotte.
We haven't seen much difference with Keir Starmer when it comes to the war from the Conservatives, from the government. And I think Labour in this sense is still recovering from the Corbyn trauma. And God knows how long it's going to take them to actually saying things that capable of criticizing Israel when Israel deserves it and support Israel when Israel deserves it. Right now, there is a kind of a fear, a built-in fear because how it's going to pan out with what happened there. And I think that Labour should liberate it itself and have actually a policy, develop a kind of more nuanced policy when it comes to Israel. And I think they will when they come to power. I know it's not a popular view here, that they will come to power. With Trump, who dares to think about this possibility that Trump will return to the White House? It will be chaos again. And is he going to go back to his deal of the century? We saw what happened. Does he still think that withdrawing from the JCPOA was just a brilliant idea? We have seen the consequences of this. So it's, I think at the end of the day, this is a huge difference. We can't put it together. Keir Starmer's letter tells he's a responsible politician. He will bring policies might be popular with some parts of the people, but it will be, I think, for what I hear, try to advance a two-state solution, maybe more than right now the government now. With Trump, predict the unpredictable.
Charlotte, Keir Starmer and Trump, what do you make their contribution likely to be?
I don't have that much to differ or add to Yossi, really. I think Trump is made of the same as Netanyahu. So put those two together. I dread to think, to be honest. They both live in the face of rules, have extraordinary charisma, which enables them to get away with terrible stuff. And I find it hard to find hope in predict the unpredictable. Starmer, I also think that the UK will have even less sway with Trump in the White House than it already does. With Starmer, it's a really difficult issue for him to come into, if he's going to be minister, to come into power with this going on is his ultimate nightmare, because it's the big split issue on Labour. As us Conservatives, we have Europe, and then we have Israel-Palestine as the major identifier. I think it's going to take a very long time to heal from the Corbyn trauma, and I don't think he's going to be able to be impartial without fear or favour, as I think instinctively he'd want to. I'm interested in where the Lib Dems, if there's a Conservative wipeout, as many think there will be, it's going to be very interesting to see how the Lib Dems sit in that. What seats go to the Lib Dems in the south, where people Layla Moran sit, whether there is a Labour Lib Dem coalition government, speaks with authority and a personal connection. That dynamic could be very interesting, as Starmer could pass off some of the more Palestine stuff to Lib Dem coalition partners. That's the way it went. So I think we shouldn't forget the Lib Dems in all that. They're not going to be a huge party, but like in 2010, they could make a decisive difference.
Okay. I'm going to bring it to an end there, and just conclude. I mean, firstly, I want to say a very warm thank you to the three panelists that we've had, all absolute experts in their own way and able to bring a different insight to each of the questions. And Conservative European Forum is really appreciative to you, and also to all those who have stayed on the call. We started with over 50, we still have sort of over 30 who've stayed on, and I'm really grateful for that. I find it very difficult to act as chair in this situation and not say anything, as colleagues would no doubt know. But just to say briefly, I've done a piece for the Arab News for this week, in which I shift or seek to shift the UK position. I think we should call unequivocally for a ceasefire now. We should call also for the release of the hostages. We should set out what we believe will have to be the answer, which is a completely comprehensive settlement involving West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza, because no Arab state is going to get involved in anything that's half measures. I think Israel will need, both sides are going to need to change significantly on this. Israel will have to realize that the occupation is over, make that very clear, make it clear that Israeli policy is the self-determination of the Palestinian people, because that's the only way we will get the work done to get a comprehensive settlement and get it done. And that is where we have to be. There is no justification for what happened on October the 7th, but if it's never to happen again, then we need the comprehensive settlement. And I've set out how I think that might usefully be done. For the avoidance of doubt, this is a zero Peroni that I've been drinking during the course of the event. But if people do say there's no going back to October the 6th that we've all mentioned, we'll go back to October the 6th and this false status quo, unless there's really radical measures taken to make sure we don't. And if there is any hope in this, which I hope and always assume there is, that's why we're all in politics, it's got to be that it is so bad things can genuinely only get better, but we've got to work for that, not just expect it to happen. So I hope that's a good note on which to finish. Very grateful to Conservative European Forum and to everyone who's been involved. thank you all very much for staying on. Again, a big thank you to our panelists, and good night to everyone. Safe journey home if you have been watching from anywhere other than the warmth of your own hearth. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Yossi and Charlotte, very much. See you both
Thank
again
you.
very soon.